Welcome to the St. Louis Art Museum's Art Speaks program. My name is Jessica Kennedy, and I am the educator for adult learning at the museum. Before we begin, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A section located on your screen. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the program, and we will choose a few to answer at the end. Also, there is live auto transcription available for this program. Please click the CC icon to activate or deactivate the subtitles. For today's talk, Art Speaks, Philip Guston and Impure Painting, we are joined by Molly Moog, Research Assistant for Modern and Contemporary Art here at the St. Louis Art Museum. Thanks for being here today, Molly.
Hi, thanks, Jessica. Thanks so much. So I am really thrilled to have the opportunity today to speak about the work of Philip Guston on the occasion of a special installation of Guston's work at the St. Louis Art Museum. This installation celebrates Emily Pulitzer's promised gift of the 1978 Guston painting Dark Room, which you can see at the far left of the screen. And is shown in the installation with several paintings and a lithograph in the museum's collection from Guston's mid to late career. Guston is a great example of an artist for whom it can be really revealing to look at his works across time. He's widely known for his transition in the late 1940s from painting figurative and representational art to abstract expressionism, and then in the 1970s to a new kind of figuration based on a vocabulary of recurring imagery. By discussing his abstract and representational works together, I hope to examine some of the through lines in the way he thought about painting across his lifetime. Guston was born Philip Goldstein in Montreal in 1913 to Jewish parents who had immigrated from Odessa. He grew up in Los Angeles, where he attended high school and became friends with Jackson Pollock. And after college, he took classes at the Otis Art Institute and worked in politically committed and WPA muralism in Los Angeles and later in New York. In the late 1940s, he started to work on more personal imagery and in easel painting rather than in muralism. After teaching at the State University of Iowa in the early 1940s, Guston received a position here in St. Louis, where he moved in 1945. And he taught painting at Washington University in St. Louis for 2 years before he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Rome Prize from the American Academy. On the screen, you can see two of Guston's earliest easel paintings, Martial Memory from 1941 on the left, which is in the museum's collection, and If This Be Not I from 1945 on the right in the collection of Washington University. And in this presentation, I'm going to show a couple of comparative works from the Washington University collection that are not in the installation at the museum, but I think they demonstrate this great strength of Guston's work that we're really lucky to have here in the St. Louis community, thanks to the artist's local connections. So in the works on the screen, Guston depicted children playing at war in Midwestern cityscapes as an allegory for the actual violence that was occurring in the 1940s as World War II was raging in Europe. With these masked figures in theater-like settings, you can see how Guston was working through the influence of other artists like Max Beckmann, who would go on to fill Guston's vacant role at Washington University after he left. In If This Be Not I, the child in pajamas at the bottom left reclines over a broken fence, almost like a lifeless body. The absence of illumination and vision is made literal in this painting by a discarded light bulb and a toppled candle, as well as the children whose faces and eyes are mainly concealed. Scraps of newspaper strewn across the ground reinforce the connection to real events. Even at this early point in his career, Guston was thinking about how everyday objects and situations can be a more poignant and open-ended way of connecting with contemporary socio-political concerns. In 1950, Guston moved to Manhattan, where he became a major figure among abstract expressionists. Along with his contemporaries like Robert Motherwell, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko, Guston abandoned working with recognizable images to create expressive content in a more direct way that privileged color, composition, and painterly gesture, freed from metaphor, illusion, and literary qualities. However, Guston's style of abstraction is different from that of his contemporaries. By the late 1950s, he was working in very deliberate and thoughtful way with these sort of thick accretions of marks, as you can see on the works on the screen, Fable 1 from Washington University and Room 112 from the St. Louis Art Museum. This kind of work is very different from Pollock's freeform drips, for example, or Rothko's fields of color. The year after he made Room 112, Guston described abstraction as a sort of absence, stating that he didn't see why the loss of faith in the known image and symbol in our time should be celebrated as a freedom. It is a loss from which we suffer, and this pathos motivates painting and poetry at its heart. Guston's statement about the loss of faith in the known image reflects larger currents of thought that challenge the possibility of representation in the aftermath of the horrors of World War II. Such as Theodor Adorno's statement published in 1955 that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. However, even while working in abstraction, Guston was seemingly drawn to the image. Over the course of the 1950s, his abstractions became denser and more solid. You can almost see in the works on the screen images trying to surface from these dense clusters of forms. This effect comes partly from the contrast between these dark, dense and frontal clusters at the center and the lightness and looseness and luminosity at the edges of these works. Abstract expressionism was meant to be a break from historical modes of painting, but rather than using all over and diffuse fields of marks, Guston preserved the distinction between figure and ground in his works. Through abstract forms, he was working through the complex compositional structures of historical paintings, like those by Piero della Francesca and Paolo Uccello that he had seen in his fellowship in Rome. Into the 1960s, Guston continued to increase the density of his work, building up layers of marks atop one another. In works like Group 1 on the screen, closely packed gray and black forms are relieved just by faint touches of color, like the blush pink and orange that are sort of peeking out from beneath. Guston admitted that he sometimes understood these clustered black forms in these paintings as heads. Even the title of his work, Group 1, suggests this possibility of figural associations. Guston claimed to have tried to banish the thought of heads from his mind because he didn't want the works to resolve into that kind of representation. He said he wanted to create works that would baffle him for some time. He was fascinated with the idea of testing what painting could be, as though it was in the process of being invented and the norms of figuration didn't exist yet. In a 1966 interview, he expressed a wish to be the first painter and to paint as a caveman would, as if nothing had existed before. These paintings of the mid-1960s are also really interesting because in addition to creation, erasure was really central to Guston's process. So he started these by laying down black forms and then added white over the black in this wet on wet technique as a means of kind of trying to cover or obliterate the black forms. And then this mixture of paints that results creates these layers of different grays that hold really understated variation of tone and color, which you can see here. At the end of the 1960s, Guston returned to representation with a series of small paintings, each of individual figures or objects. And then he began incorporating this imagery into large-scale canvases. He exhibited them for the first time in 1970 at the Marlborough Gallery in New York. And these paintings featured a lot of motifs from his early figural work, including brick walls, light bulbs, and books, along with images of hooded figures resembling Ku Klux Klan members, which Guston had also depicted in the 1930s in works that were critical of racially motivated violence. Guston described his late turn to figuration as a response to the socio-political turmoil of 1968 and 69, including the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, and the attacks by police and National Guardsmen on crowds outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The title of this talk, Philip Guston and Impure Painting, comes from Guston's 1977 statement in an interview about returning to paint representationally, in which he claimed that he got sick and tired of all that purity, a reference to abstraction, and he wanted to tell stories. He spoke of the conflict that he felt in the late 1960s, reading about the Vietnam War and the violence going on in America, and then going into his studio to change a red to a blue in his abstract paintings. Following this impulse, he began instead to depict objects like shoes, books, light bulbs, and clocks that were either isolated or could be combined to different effects. Each of them held symbolisms that were art historical, cultural, mundane, or personal to the artist. Thus, there's no single interpretation of these works, but they bring up numerous questions, possibilities, and associations. Guston seemed to have also drastically changed his style to one that critics described as cartoon-like, and that appears to be linear and graphic, like a drawing. But when you look closely at Guston's work from the 70s, like the painting Ancient Painter, which you see on the screen, you can see that the brushwork's actually very lush and painterly, with these layers of dark obscured beneath the pink paint. So that in some ways, this paint handling reflects a continuity of his abstract expressionist work. Yet when works like these were shown at the Marlborough Gallery in Guston's first exhibition in 4 years, they were really famously met with outrage by critics and by some other artists. And some people felt that Guston had abandoned the tenets of abstraction without embracing these current norms of avant-garde figuration. His paintings were nostalgic and deeply self-reflexive, rather than cool and removed, like pop art, for example. And in this work, Ancient Painter, from a few years after the Marlborough show, we see an isolated hand holding a paintbrush. The brush paints a line that doesn't stop at the edge of the book it paints on, but crosses it. It doesn't obey the rules of painting, which brings up these questions like, is the hand painting a line in a book, or is it painting the book itself and everything around it? Is it the author of the painting itself? Could it be a reference to the hand of the artist, Guston's own hand? Above the hand are cartoon speech bubbles with no text. These empty speech bubbles and the book with only a single unfinished line communicate the idea of incomplete or frustrated communication. With the return to recognizable imagery, the meaning of Guston's paintings became arguably no more clear or fixed than before when they were abstract. Before, he painted abstract forms that never materialized into a particular sign. Later, these became identifiable signs that corresponded to an infinite and constantly changing set of meanings. In Guston's 1975 painting Allegory, he depicted himself in a sort of caricature as the blue one-eyed head in profile, surrounded by other artists that he knew. Guston is looking down at his friend, the composer Morton Feldman, while the sculptor Raoul Haig is using a whip to flog a pile of shoes. In the background, the head rising over the horizon is a reference to Guston's wife, the poet Musa McKim Guston. Here, Guston is investigating different forms of art making in his own take on an allegorical painting, a historical form of painting in which the depicted subjects have both surface and hidden meanings. Allegorical paintings illustrate complex ideas and concepts in a reductive symbolic form. In them, images make up a language that isn't immediately comprehensible, but has to be puzzled over, taking into consideration the associations and conventions of each image. The pictures in the images in the back left of Guston's allegory are these geometric shapes and measuring tools that are plucked directly from Albrecht Dürer's 1514 allegorical print Melancholia on the right. In Melancholia, Dürer addressed the artistic endeavor through cryptic symbols that may stand in for abstract ideas such as creativity, reason, and spirit. But this is also one of those artworks that has been endlessly analyzed and interpreted, while its many subjects have never been definitively determined. Guston was, as we know, fascinated by this idea of that a work of art was something that could slip, degrade, and its meaning could change over time, kind of taking on new associations. We also know that Guston always had a reproduction of this print on his kitchen wall, along with a few of his other favorite artworks. As in Durer's Melancholia, Guston's allegory contains a number of symbols that seem to comment on the nature of art making. The dismembered hand that's coming down from above recalls the hand of God, the creator, who is arguably the first artist, coming down from the sky in Renaissance paintings. Other references to painting include these strewn brushes and dabs of colored paint that leave traces on a pile of shoes on the right. But even the drooping cigarette of Morton Feldman looks like it's in the process of metamorphosing into a paintbrush. In the center, the sculptor Raoul Haig strikes a whip in the gesture that recalls the flagellation of Christ in one of Guston's favorite paintings by Piero della Francesca. As Guston would have known, whipping is an action that came to be associated with the expiation of sins when it was taken up by self-flagellants in the Middle Ages. The jumble of dismembered limbs that he whips is a recurring image for Guston. In it, these everyday personal objects of shoes become really uncanny and disconcerting as they're separated from their connection to the human body and amassed in these piles. The meaning of these symbols shifts from one Guston painting to the next, but it's clear that this complex work, in this complex work, Guston is considering these really large questions of how art communicates and holds layered significance. By including portraits of artists from different disciplines, he's thinking about semiotics and how words in poetry, forms in sculpture, and images in painting are all different ways of creating meaning. Dark Room from 1978 is a promised gift of Emily Pulitzer, around which the museum's installation is organized. In it, you can see a room at night where the darkness itself is thick and really opaque, as if the air were solid. Out of the left side comes an arm holding what might be a paintbrush with red paint that extends towards a light bulb and a tabletop that seem to hang in midair. The light is turned on, but the rays that are coming from it barely seem to illuminate the room. On the tabletop, a book lies open, but the text is only abstract marks. This is a really dark painting that was possibly made after Guston's wife, Musa, experienced a stroke that year. In the wake of Musa's stroke, Guston withdrew from the art scene and suffered from anxiety and depression. Dark Room brings to mind Guston's practice of painting around the clock. In 1977, he told his friend William Corbett that he slept in his splattered painting shirt so that he could wake up and move directly to the studio without needing to change. In Dark Room, the extended arm of the artist rests on a stool, as though it's tired and in need of support. The round shape on the hand could be a watch with no band that's actually embedded into the flesh, a sort of internal clock that keeps ticking through the night and throughout life, signaling the passing of time. Even at night, and possibly in bed, the artist is wearing a watch and holding a paintbrush. The artist's brush reaches out, but there's no canvas in front of it to paint. The touches of red on the table and on the hand itself correspond to the color of the paint on the brush. This could be a hint that this painting, like many of Guston's late works, is a sort of self-portrait that's also about the artist's process of painting. Meanwhile, there are several symbols that suggest the challenges of an artist's search for meaning, including this naked light bulb that doesn't illuminate the room, and the illegible book that withholds knowledge. There's so much beautiful subtlety and variation to the brushstrokes and color in this painting. And yet the objects depicted have this sort of heaviness and bulkiness, almost an intentional crudity that suggests a labored effort as though painting under a burden. Although their meanings are ambiguous and constantly morphing, the objects themselves are completely dense and solid, as stationary. There is a way in which the painting is insistently worldly. Guston refuses to allow it to be transcendent, light, or sublime. The critic Harold Rosenberg called Guston's late work a liberation from detachment, suggesting the idea that Guston didn't separate his work from the awkward, disappointing, and disillusioning parts of life, such as the failure of interpersonal relationships, or of the so-called American dream, the changes that a body goes through, and the constant uncertainties that artists face about the significance and value of art making and of life. Some of Guston's last works before he passed away in 1980 were a group of lithographs that he made with the California Print Workshop, Gemini, GEL. Gemini had to bring the transfer paper and lithographic plates to Guston's home in Woodstock, New York, because he'd suffered a heart attack and he wasn't able to travel or to paint large-scale canvases. One of these Gemini lithographs, Room, on the right, is included in the museum's installation. And it's an interesting opportunity to see how Guston has channeled the unique quality of line in his late work within this dense and waxy medium of lithographic crayon. The print features one of Guston's characteristic images, this pile of attached legs ending in upturned shoe soles. As a comparison, you can see this motif in the earlier monumental work on the left, Edge. Edge is almost like a surrealist landscape in which the legs form an impenetrable kind of architecture, isolated within the stark black and red landscape where there's no indication of scale or no spatial clarity. In the lithograph on the right, in contrast, the legs are piled atop a familiar stool in a claustrophobic domestic interior. The only visual outlet is this window in the back that's been blocked and covered over by a scroll-like window shade. This is an image that operates on many levels. As I mentioned earlier, there's something really disconcerting and uncanny about the legs that are separated from their respective bodies and joined together. But this motif has often also been associated in the literature around Guston to images of the Holocaust and of liberated concentration camps that we know Guston viewed for the first time in the mid-1940s. However, despite their oversized presence overwhelming this domestic space in the print, the legs refuse to really fully resolve into individual bodies or to any logical and discrete forms. They might perhaps suggest the idea of experiences that are so horrific that they cannot be assimilated into coherent narratives or representations. In using such images, Guston might have been thinking about how we represent the unrepresentable or how we bear witness to its unrepresentability. He channeled these concerns through symbols that are deeply familiar to us and that are not removed from our everyday existence. So that even at its most urgent and critical moments, he practiced the kind of painting that drew directly from ordinary and yet truly evocative imagery. And for this reason, much like in his favorite historical works of art, his painting continues to take on new meanings to this day. Thanks. Jessica, I think, do you want to take some questions?
Yeah, thank you, Molly. Thank you. That was wonderful. So if anyone has questions, I encourage you to type them into the Q&A box right now. And we'll give people some time to do that. I actually did have a question. Always when looking at the painting, the allegory painting, I always wonder, I don't know if you've read anything or if the artist said anything about the kind of the black oval that is near the sculptor's mouth area. Is there have you read anything about that? That is always bothered me.
I haven't read anything about that, but I do sort of recognize that shape. To me, it looks like the steering wheel of a car.
Okay, that's kind of what okay.
And that's a symbol, again, just like in a lot of Guston's work, there are these recurring symbols that kind of morph So, here it's a mouth, somewhere else it's a steering wheel. And sometimes I think when Guston was painting, he talked about sort of starting to paint a form and just almost like seeing what it became, almost like these known images that kind of popped up in his brain.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. That's because I always either envisioned it as a steering wheel or like a fan, like a fan
Mhm.
suction of some kind, but that steering wheel.
But I think that's some of the interest of these kind of symbols, that they kind of not like the cigarette that is also a paintbrush. They kind of don't really land exactly in one place or another, but they exist in this kind of in between area.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. So I don't think we have any questions yet, so please, folks, type them in, questions or comments. So then, Molly, I will ask you, as you were working on this presentation, was there anything that you in your research found that was particularly surprising to you about this artist, or just a tidbit that was fascinating, but that like didn't make it into the talk?
Oh gosh, something that didn't make it into the talk. I mean, there's so much that didn't make it into the talk. Like I think his early work is really fascinating. So I didn't have a lot of time to kind of talk about that. Those early works that, like If This Be Not I, where he's kind of looking to a lot of other figures like Beckmann I mentioned, or Picasso. That there's a lot to learn about those early works. That's quite fascinating. It was interesting thinking about some of his practices later in life. Like I didn't know, for example, that he painted at night often, which I discovered in the process of looking at Dark Room, and that kind of changed my feelings about some of his late work, and this idea that of a painter who's always kind of the painter part of his brain is never turned off, right? Even at night, he's sort of thinking about these ideas and processing them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so we have a few that have popped here, or popped up rather. Do you know how many of the easel paintings from the 40s exist, roughly?
Oh gosh, I don't know how many, but there's a good amount of them. There's many I didn't show, but we're lucky to have two really special ones in the St. Louis community, because Marshall Memory is basically one of his first kind of mature easel paintings, that one at the St. Louis Art Museum. And then If This Be Not I is a really, really beautiful and special painting at the Kemper Museum at Washington University that actually figures his daughter is depicted in it as well as one of the children. But that's a work that just holds so much, really, there's so much to draw out.
Yeah, great, interesting. Actually, we have a couple that are asking similar questions, and I think you mentioned some of the artists, but basically, who were some of the artists that may have influenced him, Guston, on his journey? Or was he a part of a community of artists, and did that inform his creative process at all?
Yes, definitely. He was an artist who had many like contemporaries who were friends of his. Some of the people, for example, who you see depicted in Allegory, and not just painters or visual artists, but he was friends with a lot of poets and writers, which is really interesting. Very much thinking about different forms of art making, but he was really, truly very influenced by the art of the past too. So, like I said, he had that Rome fellowship. So he was fascinated by like classical sculpture in Rome and by Renaissance painting. Piero della Francesca, Paolo Uccello, I mentioned, Picasso, Beckmann. These are just a few. And of course, his contemporaries, abstract expressionists, were, people that he talked about art a lot with.
You did talk a little bit about, I think in the 70s, kind of like the critics' reaction to his work. What was what were the responses, I guess, from the market or from art critics or anything, with the huge shift in visual aspects of him? Was there I don't know, anything about that?
Yeah, that show, the Marlborough show, was sort of like a controversy almost that swept the art world because, like I said, he hadn't shown his work in several years, and he had gone from, painting these at least semi-abstract works, and then the next thing he showed years later were these works that really kind of shocked people. And not to say that all of the responses were negative, but there was definitely a lot of negative press. So I think that was hard for him. I don't know that he was, selling a lot of that work at the time. But he continued to make that kind of work. And I think time has shown that, that I think they've gained sort of new interpretation over time. And now I think in a time too, where people are less bound to these sort of strict movements or ideas of what kind of things someone should be painting at a certain time, I think that he was sort of like a forerunner of that he wasn't really feeling bound by either the abstract or the figurative norms of his day, but was really doing his own thing.
Mm-hmm. All right, I think this can be possibly our last question. Someone has asked if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about kind of the core tenets of the movement of abstract expressionism, I guess, to kind of give a little bit of perspective on that. So I don't know, some of those ideals, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a little bit like this statement by Theodor Adorno about this sort of difficulties of painters feeling difficult about what figurative art was able to achieve in this period in which so much horrific things had happened that are really difficult to represent. And I think that they turned towards abstract art that was less about using metaphor or these literary qualities to evoke a story, but more just about thinking about what paint does on canvas. And some of it was also about the sort of actions that the painter was taking, and the paint, it was understood a lot at the time as a representation. The paint on canvas was a representation of the painter's act of painting as a sort of performance almost. But also painters were interested in investigating these, like different forms, the arrangement of color, form, shape on the canvas, the qualities of paint itself, viscosity, texture, all of these things. What about when the bare canvas is showing? Where are forms on the canvas? Just all these questions about the formal nature of paint on canvas that can be achieved and looked at without engaging the human figure or representational art.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, of course, coming out of like other earlier developments, Cubism, Surrealism, and different ways of thinking about art in the post-war period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, great, thank you. I've got some comments just saying thanks so much for your talk. So I think that's where we're going to end it today. So thank you so much, Molly. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. I encourage everyone to come and see the installation if you haven't already, but we'd love to see you here. And of course, please continue to visit slam.org/events to register for upcoming virtual and in-person programming at the museum. And I will also say, if you have young children in your life or you are a child at heart, I highly recommend coming to the museum this weekend to enjoy our winter celebrations program that is happening on Saturday and Sunday. So please visit the website for more information. And with that, I'll say, have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.